Ambassador, it's such a pleasure to host you on the Africa Leadership Dialogues. Now, you've been in the development space, in the diplomatic space for many years. Just looking at Africa today, I want to get a sense of where you think the continent is in terms of development. What are our greatest challenges? What are our greatest opportunities?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your program. And just to get straight to the point, I'm one of those people who believes that Africa is at a very important point in its development progression. And Africa is really no different than many other continents in the world, in spite of what people might want to say. Right. And there's always a time of transition. There are times of inflection when political processes, economic processes, social processes come together and things begin to happen. There are times when things go forward, and then sometimes there are times when things unfortunately pull back. Mm-hmm. The key to all of this is usually the kind of leadership that you have in a country, the kind of friends and relationships that your country has with other countries, mm-hmm. friendships, if you will, that your country has with other countries, particularly its neighbors. And when a country or a continent like ours has gone through the experience that it went through in the 20th century, where most of it was spent in a colonial experience, right. and then the latter part in a neo-colonial experience, where you are trying to unwind the problems and the difficulties that were created by colonialism.
And the systems and the processes.
And the systems and
right.
the processes, the undereducated, no educated people, bad governments, bad leaders. You had to work your way out of this, and you need to work your way out mm-hmm. of this. And we're right now at the point where at 50, which is really where most African countries are, 50, 60 years old, mm-hmm. you really get this new crop of leaders who are born of an independent state, who are believing in themselves, who are well educated, who see a different vision for the continent, who've already seen what has happened in the past and want something different for their future. Mm-hmm. And so you will find, and if you look across the continent, that there are a number of countries right now that are beginning to outperform in very special ways because of their leadership, because they've been through these difficulties, and because they now have enough of a crop of leaders, of entrepreneurs, of social actors to begin to transform the nations and to make them move forward. So we are in a very special space is what I'm saying. And it'll take us about maybe another 5-10 years to truly maximize the opportunity that this space provides. But we are getting there.
I'll come back to challenges in a moment, but I want to tap into the environment that we're in and the fact that for many, many years, many African countries didn't quite have a seat at the global table. Mm-hmm. And fighting for that space, fighting for relevance, trying to create an African agenda or national agendas for foreign policy. You have led the world in really putting together the SDGs. In so many ways, you've been at the forefront of development globally within the UN system. And I think you're perfectly placed to speak to whether or not African leaders are starting to build enough confidence to take a seat at the table and to ensure that the interests of their African constituents are represented as they sit at that table. Is it happening at all?
Oh, absolutely. And it's always happened.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. Let's understand each other.
Yes.
The reason why Africa got its independence a short 50 years ago mm-hmm. was precisely because African leaders engaged the international community, engaged the colonial leaders, and broke them down and finally created the opportunities for independence. This did not happen willy-nilly. Right. It happened because there were political leaders with vision, with determination. But we are looking at a different challenge right now. And I think this is what you're pointing at the challenge of development, the challenge of accelerated development that is able to keep up with the challenges of society, and the challenges of the economy. This crop of leaders who are now coming into their own are indeed truly engaging the international community. You know, you've seen the president of Kenya at the G7, at the Belt and Road conference in China, at the UN, manifesting himself in a way in which you can only be proud of if you're a Kenyan. And it is because the moment has arrived in history where we need that kind of leadership to put us in those positions where we are able to engage with the other leaders of the world in a way in which we can become truly drivers of our own political, economic, and social process. And I might add that if we play our cards right, we can even become drivers of a global agenda, as we indeed did with the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda for Development.
You know, that's transformational. And for many of us who grew up in an Africa where, let's be honest, in many ways, we were taught to self-loathe. We were taught there was hopelessness on this continent of ours. We were taught we can't achieve certain things. So to hear you say that we could start to push the global agenda, let alone the African agenda, is totally reframing the way we think. I want to focus for a moment on looking at the transition between that push for independence, self-determination, the vision for Africa, and somehow there seemed to be a disconnect somewhere in the middle. And now we're at a place where you're saying we're getting it together again in terms of leadership. What did we get wrong, do you think, in between? And what mistakes do we need to avoid moving forward?
I don't know that we got things wrong per se, although of course there were terrible leadership issues. It was that we didn't have the institutions to allow us to organize ourselves in ways in which we could become powerful and meaningful in the world. Right now, we saw the transition from the OAU to the AU. A lot of people are very cynical and dismissive of the AU. I am a great admirer of that institution because of what it's trying to do under very difficult circumstances, using and working with countries that are themselves challenged. It's like having a membership that is made up of poor people. It's not going to do exceptional things, and it might aspire to, but it might be limited by its resources. But despite all of that, we now have Vision 2063, which is an amazing vision that is looking to help African countries come together, organize together to transform their continent.
With a common agenda.
With a common agenda, because it's only a common agenda. It's only working together, as I said a little earlier, with your neighbors that's going to allow us to get where we want to get to faster and fastest. And in my opinion, we have to appreciate that it needed to take time. We needed to go through the transition of building our human capital, of putting together our private sector, of putting together our institutions, of putting together credible constitutions that allowed ownership, and allowed the passion of the people to manifest itself in society. We had to get there, and that needed to take the necessary time. And some countries did it faster than others. Some countries did it better than others, precisely because they had either opportunities presented to them by history, or were lucky that they had the right leadership that got them there faster. So leadership is a very crucial part of this equation, but it is a necessary but not sufficient part. There has to be something else. The population has to come on board. The population has to take responsibility. The population has to have discipline. The population has to invest. It's not all about leadership. It's also about everybody getting on board.
Let's tap into that, because I know, we've mastered the art of attacking our politicians and complaining constantly. So let's talk about the responsibility that the citizenship has a little bit more. If you were to speak to all the viewers now about how they start to embrace that responsibility, what would you say?
Well, charity starts at home. We've just come from Rwanda with you, where we had a exceptional meeting. I was in Rwanda as the United Nations resident coordinator in charge of UN programs in Rwanda a few years after the genocide. The country was on its knees, literally. Nothing worked. it looked like the war zone that it had just been. We were there together and we saw the state of Kigali.
Incredible.
Beautiful, clean, manicured, literally, by people's hands. Transformed by a leadership, but by a citizenry that is disciplined and willing and able to be led.
Right.
And what we have seen and what we have to understand is that individuals have to make a choice as to whether their environment around which they live is clean, is maintained, and that the accumulative action of each individual around their own personal environment will ultimately spread out into a cleaner, better environment for all to live in.
Right.
That's one way. But there are other ways in which individuals can make choices. We consume and produce things. We have choices. If you're going to consume things that are impairing your health, that are creating overweight, obese people, these are things that are going to affect not just your health, but the community in which you live, because as you consume, you create a burden, especially if it's affecting your health, on the healthcare system
right.
in ways in which we are spending monies trying to get you slim again and or keep you fit again, when you could just go out there, one, avoid fatty foods, avoid all the wrong things that you should be eating, and exercising every day.
Right.
Now, that's a personal decision that every consumer has to make. Government isn't going to sort that one out for you, for sure, you see? And there are other decisions about the kind of products we use, the vehicles that we are using.
Right. How we
drive,
operate on our roads.
Absolutely.
Right.
So there are many decisions that you can make at a personal level, at a family level, at a community level, all of which can have huge impact in the way in which your society and your economy develops.
That's really powerful. And, you know, we could all just sit back for a moment and ask ourselves, in our environments, are we being responsible? Can we do better? What can we do better? Because ultimately it all leads into whether we succeed or not. Decisions. I want to come to the development agenda now. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, before I ever met you, I heard of you, and I heard of you internationally. People said there is this Kenyan who has been at the forefront of creating the SDGs. Now, I want you to speak to those who are not very familiar with what these SDGs are. What impact could they have on our lives? Why were these development goals set up? And what could they mean for Africa, for Kenya, for Rwanda, for Nigeria, for South Africa? What could they mean?
The SDGs are nothing but everybody's aspiration for a better world, a sustainable world. We're going to develop. Every country is going to develop. The question is, are you going to develop well, or are you going to develop badly? If you develop badly, you end up in a dirty city, with bad infrastructure, with chaotic traffic, with criminality, with terrorism. There are many ways to develop. It's still a development. After all, even our country has developed over the last 50 years. Could it have done better? For sure. So the question is, what kind of development do we want? We want sustainable development, one in which we're able to protect our environment, one in which we're able to protect our rivers, one in which we're able to protect our seas and oceans, one in which we're able to protect our food sources. Why? Because if we don't, we won't make it. And I'm not saying that in a light sense. I'm saying there's a gentleman called Professor Hawkins, who people may have heard of.
Yes, Stephen Hawkins.
Stephen Hawkins. He said about a couple of weeks ago that if humanity continues on the same trajectory, ignoring the imperative of creating a sustainable planet, okay, dealing with issues of climate change, issues of managing our oceans, which we are killing, issues of managing our forests, which we are destroying, issues of managing our fisheries in our rivers and our lakes, which we are busy over-consuming. We will not be able to live on this planet 100 years from now. Does that sound like a long time? 100 years? It's a very short time, if you ask me. because that would have meant that if this was happening during my grandparents' time, I would not be alive today because I would not have a planet in which to live.
This is a threat to our grandchildren.
So your grandchildren are basically being tracked for unsustainability. So the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is why they've caught on in the world. This is why America, China, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, it doesn't matter, Latin America, it doesn't matter where you go, they are talking about them now because they've recognized that what we have been trying to get across is actually true.
I want to continue in that vein. You know, it's a sobering thought that this is literally about survival, these development goals. And the government on this planet of ours, the government of Kenya has, incorporated the SDGs into the performance targets, which is very powerful. What do you expect to see from other stakeholders? And I must say, as our organization, we're working in schools through Great Debaters Contest to educate young Kenyans on the SDGs. So we feel as private sector, there's a role that we're playing. How would you encourage others to be part of this engagement?
Well, let's first of all start with young people. There is nothing more urgent for young people than to have a place to live and for their children to live in. Okay? For them, this is a matter of survival. My generation can probably continue living with plastic and garbage and dirty rivers. And
we're going to die off soon anyway.
We don't have that much further to go.
Going to.
Okay?
Yeah.
But for the next generation and the generation after that, this is serious. Okay? So they need to understand that they need to become invested in every government and in every administration that is going to set the stage for their future and recognize that the SDGs and governments that do embrace the SDGs are the ones that have their interest at heart. So that's one constituency. Private sector is another. The SDGs and the 2030 Agenda in particular has recognized that we are going to need not billions of dollars that, or hundreds of millions of dollars that we used to spend on development, but we're going to need trillions of dollars to get us where we need to get to in a planet that is able to sustain itself through time.
And so the question is, how do we unlock trillions?
Where do you find these trillions? Yeah. Okay? It's not going to come from aid. The so-called rich countries are running broke. They don't have money to spend on aid anymore. The new emerging economies are busy spending on themselves, although countries like China and India are doing very important things in helping others, but they have to invest in themselves first. We have to get very serious about building the capability to create the kind of wealth that we need in our countries that would help us invest in things that will ensure we have a sustainable country and a sustainable planet in which to live. And if we have this short-term vision and this short-termism that seems to determine our political choices right now, I guarantee you we won't get there. And that's why I'm very pleased as a Kenyan that the government has indeed recognized just the crucial importance of embedding the SDGs, all the Sustainable Development Goals. And by the way, people have to understand that these are goals that cut across every conceivable thing that you could possibly imagine deals with development.
So within the 17 goals, there are subsets that,
absolutely.
Yes.
You know, you're going from the basics, dealing with poverty, dealing with hunger, dealing with health, water, sanitation, education, because it doesn't matter. You can have a city like Nairobi. I read in the newspaper the other day, you had cases of cholera. Right. I mean, cholera is one of the most powerful indicators of a failing
health
city.
System.
No.
City,
not health system. It's got nothing to do with the health system. It's got to do with sanitation. And that is infrastructure. You see? So when we are although the health ministry has to run over there and try and sort out that mess, The cause of that mess
is the infrastructure.
Is the failure of the sanitation and infrastructure capabilities.
Right.
And this city is being overrun by people, and I'm afraid to say animals, since you see them all over the place as well. Mm-hmm. So we have to decide and understand that all these SDGs, from the ones that deal with those basic things, to the ones that deal with energy, the way cities are organized and managed, mm-hmm. to our earth, basically our forests, to our oceans, as I said a little earlier, right through to issues that deal with peace and security and the rule of law, right. Okay? Right through to the issues that deal with social cohesion and inclusion, because you can't have a sustainable country or a sustainable community when people hate each other, when people are going at each other because of their race, ethnicity, gender, or whatever. Mm-hmm. These are all things that we have to deal with. And the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda shows the pathway to help countries, communities, and continents, and the whole world, pathway to get where we need to get to in a healthy fashion.
You know, you've just touched on institution building and the
Right.
importance of the rule of law and the importance of peace. And, you know, several African countries very soon heading into elections. Rwanda is just around the corner. Kenya is coming up straight after that. What are your thoughts on where we are right now in terms of the democratic processes in some of our African states? And what are your hopes as we face these elections?
Well, isn't it exciting that we have democracies that are thriving on our continent? Mm-hmm. I think Kenya is an exemplar in many ways. Mm-hmm. We've had elections every 5 years since independence, some good, some not so good. Mm-hmm. But we've kept at it. It's a testament to the determination of Kenyans to remain committed to the democratic path, even with all its difficulties.
Right.
All right? Winston Churchill said, you know, democracy is a terrible system, bar any other.
It's the best we have.
Bar any other, you know. So it's for us to recognize this, yes. Embrace it, fix it, localize it, nationalize it, mm-hmm. do whatever we have to do to indigenize it in our country. Mm-hmm. But recognize that it comes with risks, and we have to manage those risks. And we must not be careless about those risks, mm-hmm. because those risks could very easily upend democracy. And by the way, it's happened in many countries in the world, in Europe and in other places, in Latin America and Asia, where you've had great democratic progress and then a sudden reversal.
Setbacks.
Okay? Mm-hmm. You know, the classic case, I guess, would be Germany, when the republic that was there just before Nazism came in collapsed on its own internecine, you know, wranglings
mm-hmm.
of which are pretty typical of democracies.
Mm-hmm. Which gave room to the rise of the Nazis.
Ideologue,
yes.
and this populist character who played on the fears and the divisions of the people and put himself in a point of, on a trajectory to the horrible genocide that happened in Rwanda too, but
in
Germany.
Europe, across Europe.
So, hey, you know, I know for a fact that we are on a path to a greater, better democracy, especially in Kenya. Mm-hmm. And I know for a fact that if the Kenyan people continue to grow their institutions, respect their institutions. I don't care whether they're talking about the police, which is much maligned, mm-hmm. the judiciary system, the education
yes.
system. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. You know, I don't care which of these institutions. If we nurture these institutions, as Kenyans,
strengthen them.
If we strengthen them, they will pay us dividends year after year, generation after generation. Mm-hmm. It's the classic story of America. And we can embrace that story.
That's another discussion we must have, is whether American institutions can stand the test of time. And under the Trump presidency, there's lots of talk about where we expect America to go. You're based in New York. Do you have, very quickly, just some thoughts on where America is today and what it means in terms of leadership?
I think America is exactly where it needs to be today.
Okay.
It is the atypical democratic experience, in the sense that it continually reinvents itself. And a lot of people have been slightly taken aback by the Trump presidency. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to recognize that he came out of a political process that Americans have accepted. Mm. And that they are moving ahead. Is there an opposition? Of course, that's what democracy is about.
This is what democracy
is. That's what it's about.
This is the nature of the game.
But what are the Democrats doing in America? Hmm. They're busy in the Senate, in the Congress. They're busy in the communities, dealing with the fallout of their loss. Hmm. Okay? Hmm. What President Trump represents is the loss that they failed to retain power. Right. So he may be an unusual character, but maybe that's his attraction.
And I think, you know, what's interesting about America, for instance, when it comes to the questions of climate change, which his administration does not embrace, mm-hmm. you see states stand up and say, we have a different position. Absolutely. California says this is our position, right. and they continue rolling, right. which is a fascinating concept.
Absolutely, and that's how it should be.
Right, right.
And to be fair, there are aspects of his own administration that simply wants to deal with the climate change challenge differently than it has been dealt with previously. So we have yet to see his hand on this issue, and I'm sure we will soon.
Okay, so we already have come to the end of the interview. I am going to welcome you back when you are next in Nairobi. We hope to host you with a group of Kenyans and primarily young people. Absolutely. To have a discussion. But for now, I would ask you to please look into the camera and just deliver a message to Africa. You know, in many ways, we've spoken about the work that you do, and you say, you know, I do not do it for me. In many ways, I do it for the legacy it gives to Kenya. The legacy for Africa, and the responsibility that I have is important for that legacy. What would you teach, or what would you share with the Africans watching this show?
Well, what I would say is that the future of the continent is amazingly bright, and it attracts us. It only seeks for us to believe in ourselves as Africans and to believe in the potential of our continent. That's all. And if we do that, we will amaze ourselves and amaze everyone else in the incredible future that awaits us.
Do you believe? All you need to do is just sit down for a moment, think about Africa, and believe in the potential. And then you'll find your position in actualizing that. Thank you so much. What a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
You're welcome. I'm very welcome.